Hello and welcome to this Airtime interview as part of our special week dedicated to pilots. My name is Victoria Bryan and I am delighted to be here to interview a number of captains, first officers and instructors during this week when we mark International Pilots Day. We'll be bringing you some special reports and interviews from across the world as we take a deeper look into the role of pilots in our world today. Now, I'm pleased to introduce the latest pilot to join us this week, Isabelle de Montet-Guerin, who is the Chief Flying Instructor Fixed Wing at Empire Test Pilot School in the UK. Isabelle, or Izzy as she is known, has a long history of flying and a very varied one too. Among her roles, she has worked for Airbus as a test pilot in Toulouse and as a pilot for British Airways. She's done gliding with the Air Training Corps and also worked with the Air Cadets. She is a specialist in flight testing and electronic warfare. And now we're going to speak to Izzy and try and cover as many of those areas as possible. So, hello, Isabelle, and thank you for joining Airtime today to help us mark International Pilots Day.
Hi, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. So, before we go on to some of the really exciting things you've done in your career, I want to take you right back to the start and ask how you came to join the aviation industry. What was it that gave you the flying bug?
Yeah, so I have to start with a bit of a sad story, unfortunately. So my father passed on when I was very young, when I was 12 years old, but he'd always inspired me with stories of aviation, particularly in the Royal Air Force. He was a fighter pilot himself, and he had always said that he would like me to at least try flying. So after he passed, it seemed like there was no better time, and we were lucky to have enough money for a trial flying lesson, which back in the day, I still remember, was £83.66. It's a lot more now, isn't it? And I was bitten by the bug. It sounds very stereotypical, but it was from that day onwards that I really resolved to have a job in the aviation industry. And I'm just lucky that it's worked out the way it has.
Apart from your father, was there? He's obviously been your main inspiration. Then I take it. Is there anyone else who's inspired you to become a pilot or get really hooked on aviation?
So three lovely ladies. So my mum has been a wonderful support. Everything that I've done so far, I've done with the support of my mum, not just financially, but also from a human perspective. She's always maintained my morale and said, keep your eyes on that distant star, you can do anything you want. But then you've really got to go back into history as well, and there were a series of very famous female pilots. I know we're going to come on to that, but I feel like I'm jumping the gun a bit, but they are kind of important that we always draw our inspiration from people around us. So as an avid historian, Jacqueline Auriol, who was the first French female test pilot, the first French lady to break the sound barrier, and also then Valentina Tereshkova, who was the first female cosmonaut back in 1963. So there were plenty of amazing role models to really draw from.
And sort of staying on that topic, how did you find the aviation industry when you first got into it? It's obviously still a very much male-dominated sector, and even more so in past decades. So what were your first impressions when you first got into flying, and how do you think it's changed as you've progressed along your career?
So I've been very lucky in that my first exposure to flying was within the Air Training Corps. We'll come back to that, but I was lucky to be surrounded by a wonderful group of people at 634 Volunteer Gliding School, which is part of the Air Cadet gliding scheme, as was. It was based at St. Athan, and all of my friends and colleagues there were just absolutely wonderful at propelling the next generation into aviation. And then following that, again, I was lucky. I've been, as you say, within British Airways, which is a very, very supportive and protective environment for new people, not just females, but I think that BA do a very good job at bringing the best out in their people.
Okay, great. Can we go back to the Air Training Corps and your gliding experience that you just touched on there? So can you tell us a bit more what that experience was like flying for you and how it sort of shaped your desire to fly and your career?
Quite honestly, it was magical. Here you are as a basically 13-year-old child, and you have an opportunity to enter into a training system that will foster the spirit of aviation all the way through to the age of 21, if you so wish. And the aeroplanes were conventional gliders. So at the time, Grob 103, so the twin Asteer, the Viking. And the team spirit that was required to get the gliding operation off the ground, pun intended, meant that we all banded together. We had great fun, great banter. And for a first exposure to aviation, actually, I think it was ideal. I often say I owe everything to that first exposure to the Air Training Corps, and particularly to 634 Gliding School, because it helped me to become the person, foremost, that I wanted to be, not just the pilot that I wanted to be.
Great. And amongst, you've covered so many areas, it seems to me, in your career. You've done commercial flying, you've done pilot training, electronic warfare training, humanitarian aid missions, flight testing as well. You described yourself on your LinkedIn as a self-financed civilian flight test professional. How have you managed to fit it all into your CV? Because you're not very old. And what has been your favourite job or role amongst all of those?
Wow, Victoria. So I'm going to be 40 in July. And fitting it all in, that was never the goal. It was always to get to an end point. And this is my end point. I'm now an experimental test pilot. I'm the CFI fixed wing at ETPS. Actually, I'm very content with where I've got to now. And it was always the goal to get somewhere like here, whether that was in the Air Force or in civilian aviation or maybe even in aerospace. The way that things have worked out have been often quirks of fate. I've taken huge calculated risks. I think that's an important thing to say, that taking calculated risks and weighing all the options before making any decision is a good way of moving forward if you want to have an unusual career. And I started very young, so I made a choice as well to not go to university, which probably now will become the limiting factor if I wanted to apply, for example, for the European Space Agency. However, what I would say is that I'm very content and glad that I started flying early. So it's not, the decisions were also, I like to let my flying do the talking. So clearly there has to be some modicum of skill, and with that and a lot of hard work and dedication, and really not having too much of a life outside of aviation, which is just the way I wanted it, it's fallen into place. But as I say, it's all been kind of building block approaches, which is the foundation of flight test as well.
You sound incredibly determined, and it's really impressive to see that you've got to where you want to be. So you started your commercial flying career at British Airways. So could you tell us, you already spoke a little bit about them, but could you tell us about your first job there? What were you flying, and what was it that made that sort of like the first suitable building block to set you off on your career path?
I suppose we have to go back one step. Actually, I did want to join the Air Force, but my anthropological, so my functional reach, was not insufficient to join the service. Not strictly true to be a fighter pilot within the service, and that was following sixth form and flying scholarship. I was going for my final board and didn't make it through the final medical for that reason. So I again went via Syerston, which was the Central Gliding School, Central Flying School for Air Cadet Gliding. Met some friends, particularly one chap who I'll never forget, a guy called Bruce Tapson, and he said, if you want to fly, you have got to get up off the floor now and suck it up, and you've got to go and apply to the airlines. And I was 17. And I said, well, Bruce, I can certainly give it a go, but I don't think I'm going to get very far. And that's how I got into BA. I just kept on passing the stages of selection, honestly, much to my surprise, and ended up then flying or training for the 737 based out of Gatwick. And we were on the day of our license skill test, and that was 9/11. So there have been some momentous swings in this career as well. We didn't really know if we'd remain employed, what alternatives BA could suggest. And thankfully, they offered us flying jobs in the regions, and we were able to bid for a type, and I bid for the Jetstream 41, which was a fantastic little airplane, quite unforgiving, quite challenging to fly well, which is something I really enjoy in any aeroplane. Stayed on the Jetstream for about 15 months, based in Cardiff and then Leeds. So you've got to be willing to move. That's the other thing. And then we were offered a bid for Heathrow. So again, not thinking I would get it, I put my bid down for the 757 and the 767, which was, in my opinion, and I know opinions will differ, the most desirable fleet aside from Concorde, which clearly I also bid for and didn't get. But here I was with about 750 hours under my belt, and I got a 757 conversion course. And that has been my happiest time within commercial aviation. That was such a wonderful fleet to be on. The aeroplane was versatile. It was a delight to fly. The route structure was fantastic. The people were fantastic. And I stayed on the 757 and the 767 until the end of my time in BA, which was in 2010.
Wow. sounds brilliant, apart from 9/11, of course.
I think we will all, and now the current generation, of course, is facing COVID. I know we want to touch on that in a bit, but I think aviation is one of those industries that is just so dependent on world events, and so many of those tragic world events will influence the careers of thousands of people, as well as the lives of thousands of people.
Definitely. We will come back to that, but. So when you left British Airways, that's when you became, when you left British Airways, and then you came into test flying.
Yeah.
So how did you get into that? And can you tell us about some of the major projects that you did as part of that?
So with extreme difficulty is the answer. And what I would like to see in flight test is more opportunities for people like us. Right? People who don't come from that homogenous military background and who don't have a lot of money, frankly. So I was lucky to be able to save enough to buy my own house, which was on a partial mortgage, which appreciated in value, which I then sold to fund my first test pilot course. I also had, as I mentioned, help from my mum, and with the remainder of my savings and an inheritance. So now you're seeing how desperately out of reach a lot of these opportunities can be. I self-funded a Class B test pilot course at ETPS in 2010. And it was when I talk about calculated risk, that was a massive gamble, because there were not really the jobs in flight test to go to as a civilian. Upon graduation, which of course was not guaranteed, you have to reach a standard, the civilian is then almost required to go on a job search and a job hunt, which is what I did. And I went to Farnborough in 2010 following graduation in the June, I think it was. And I literally went to every pavilion with CVs and covering letters and made a right pain out of myself with all the manufacturers that were there. But off of the back of that, I got 4 interviews face-to-face and 2 offers to do some kind of flying. One was with FR Aviation and the other was with Airbus. And luckily, both of those yielded jobs.
Gosh, that's incredible. What a move. And so you were with Airbus for almost 6 years in Toulouse then as a test pilot. Can you share any stories from your time there? Any memorable experiences? What were some of your favorites? Yeah,
so I think, there you go. So the best flight test experiences I've had have been with Airbus. It was a particularly good environment for bringing up people like myself, so Class B test pilots. And about 50% of my flying was experimental and 50% of my time was on production. And I therefore managed to accrue over 2,200 hours of experimental flight test time during my tenure with Airbus. And that was the experience with which I was able to put forward a dossier for my experimental upgrade here at ETPS. So Airbus have given me that stepping stone to pursue further opportunities within aviation and specifically within flight test. And the other thing that was good with I've worked in Toulouse and Hamburg, but there was no discrimination about the kinds of projects that I would work on. So as a Class B pilot, I was as involved in the development of the 320neo, 330neo, A350, A380, as I was in test flying first flights of production aircraft.
That sounds fabulous. Which was your favorite one of those aircraft to fly?
Again, this probably won't conform with conventional opinion, but I absolutely adored the A330, specifically the 300, because it was more of a challenge to fly than the other Airbus types. And it's just a beautiful airplane to look at. I know that it's probably not a conventional thing to kind of talk about the art as well as the science, but it's got a beautiful wing cross-section. I really enjoyed flying the bigger types that were somewhat less modern, perhaps, where more pilot in the loop decisions were required. Yeah, I really enjoyed the 330.
So now you're the chief flying instructor at ETPS, and so you're inspiring the next generation of pilots there. How do you go about approaching that responsibility, and what is the key characteristic you want to see in the pilots of the future? And then also you said there about sort of how hard it is to get into this flight test sector. So what do you hope to change about that, and how are you going about changing that?
Yeah, these are all great questions. I think the first thing is to always approach any kind of job with human qualities. So sympathy, empathy, and also understand what people's constraints are, and also what their strengths are. So in bringing up the next generation, it's about fostering the best qualities we want to see in a test pilot. So that integrity, that philosophical approach, the incremental approach, the questioning mindset. And I've always said that we breed complete pains, because every time they hire a car, they will look at it in the same way as they do their flight test training here at ETPS, and everything therefore after this point will have deficiencies. And it really is that link, that engineering link. What's good, what's bad, why is it good, why is it bad? And at every turn trying to bring that on a step further, encouraging self-analysis. And when people see an aeroplane, even for the first time, is to start thinking about it from a flight test perspective rather than an operational perspective. The remainder of the job is actually a management role. It's the strategic and tactical planning to ensure that the course is delivered on time, on budget, safety, efficiency, duty of care. So planning becomes a real necessity, and I spend a lot of time trying to make all the pieces of the puzzle fit. It's therefore a fantastic challenge, and it's managing your students, your staff, aircraft availability, servicing schedules, conflicting demands for assets, and of course the overall environment in which your school operates.
Amazing. And in terms of trying to get more people interested in flight testing and making it more accessible, what can you do to do that?
So ETPS does offer a range of courses, so shorter courses that are more accessible. So we have systems assessment courses, evaluator aircrew courses, the Class B course, and then the bespoke, if you will, element whereby someone who has accrued sufficient experience and has presented a dossier of experience can then get credits towards completing further training, such as the experimental upgrade. As far as going modular, we haven't made that step yet. There's no reason why that shouldn't happen in the future. But the other thing to be kind of careful of is to make sure that the training is consolidated. So too many breaks in that training are undesirable. So I think all test pilot courses around the world are going through a modernization program. As far as making it accessible to the individual, that is a challenge that we face in the industry, and it's not one that's easily resolved. So working on it is the answer.
Definitely, yeah. Now you're also a riding coach at the California Superbike School. So I think we can assume that you're a bit of a speed demon. What comes first for you, though? Is it aircraft or is it the bikes? And how much of a crossover is there between those two interests in your life?
I can't lie, it is the aeroplanes. I do live for flying. But with the bikes, it's less the speed demon aspect and more the precision control over machinery. And there's a massive amount of crossover from the visual skills that you need to ride a bike safely. They say that 100% of the errors that a rider makes are somewhere linked to a visual problem. And it's the same in flying, essentially, being able to see everything. And I don't mean with your eyes, but take in everything, act appropriately, make appropriate decisions under pressure. I think there's a massive amount of crossover.
Great. And now, we touched on it earlier, it's been a really tough time for everyone in aviation this year. The industry's obviously seen downturns before. This one seems to have a different sort of flavour to it. What impact has the pandemic had on your professional and personal life, if I may?
Professional life, luckily, almost none. I think last year we were facing closure. We were facing a period of hiatus in training. Thankfully, we were deemed a critical asset by not just the UK Ministry of Defence, but by our defence allies worldwide. And therefore, we were tasked with continuing to deliver the course. So I've been in continuous employment, for which I'm eternally thankful, eternally grateful. We have had to adapt, as we see here. We're doing this online instead of face-to-face. Teaching online has its challenges, as we all know. Keeping people engaged and involved online is also difficult, but we're still here. We've managed to safely deliver a course in 2020, despite all the challenges, and graduate the next generation of flight test professionals for our military customer and also our civilian customers around the world. It was probably the toughest year we faced, in that we had an overlap for 2 months between the 2020 and 2021 courses, but we can all be justifiably proud of ourselves. And I'm thankful to every member of my team that's made that possible. As far as my personal life goes, as I've said, I can't really afford to take too much time away and time out in order to live what some would consider to be a normal life. So in that respect, the pandemic hasn't affected me. I think that sounds particularly sad.
No, not at all. If you're doing what you love, then you're doing what you love, and life has got to be richer for that. Do you think that there's anything positive that has come out of the pandemic for you?
No, I'm going to be honest. This is never going to be a positive experience. And, I do also want to take the time to, I think, empathise with every single one of us who has been adversely affected. I think the mental health issues, I've seen it in my own family, in my friends, in those around me. Those can't be underestimated, and we are very together animals. We're designed to kind of socialize, and it's been tough for a lot of people, and that can't be overemphasized, and I suppose it must be recognized as well. So definitely not a positive thing for anyone.
Thanks for your honesty. And hopefully looking forward to happier times. In your opinion, when do you think the aviation industry will recover?
It depends. Here goes a classic flight test answer, and I would like to think that the upturn will occur within the next 3 years, and that we'll all be back to some sense of quasi-normality. I know that particularly business jet operators are starting to recruit quite quickly, because actually people have changed the way they fly, so they no longer go en masse in a big aeroplane to a destination. Those that can afford it will buy their own aeroplanes, or they will charter. So that's one positive aspect. I think with the vaccinations, the testing, we might see some kind of easing within the near future. Hopefully that will then lead to a continuous upturn. But it depends on how this disease now is going to mutate, how the third wave, fourth wave, fifth wave is going to influence us all, and whether or not aviation will remain a viable proposition. So it's, as always, it's in the balance. I feel positive, I always do. And I'm hoping for everybody else out there that we'll see this upturn as we expect it within the next 3 years.
I certainly hope so too. Now, let's move on to something slightly more positive. I was speaking to a lot of pilots this week, and everyone's got some great flying stories. So could I get you to, I'm sure you've got a billion stories, but if you could pick one experience that you would like to share with us from the flight deck.
Wow. Okay, maybe the case of the floating chocolate bar. So one of the best flight tests that I've had the privilege to be involved in is flying testbed operations on the A380, again at Toulouse. And it often involves mounting a large aero engine on one of the inner pods, so position 2 or 3, and then going and putting that engine through its paces. And one of those tests is a negative G assurance check to make sure that the engine operates normally under conditions of particularly oil starvation for the longest feasible time that the airplane is likely to encounter those conditions. So, for example, you get an atmospheric disturbance or you need to execute an avoidance maneuver. Anyway, long story short, the airplanes are prepped very, very thoroughly for negative G flight, because the last thing you want is stuff floating around the cockpit. We had done several of these negative G parabola by this point, I think 7 or 8. And during the last parabola, a Mars bar just happened to kind of float up in front of my face. And as I was pilot non-flying for that point, it was almost like being in space. I grabbed the Mars bar, thought, thank you very much indeed. We recovered to positive G, and whilst we were waiting for the engine to do its thing and kind of settle in terms of its fuel and oil system at 1G, I kind of snacked on this Mars bar. I just thought that was incredible.
Did you ever find out who the Mars bar belonged to?
No, and I can't believe it sort of survived the prep process, but stuff gets lost in airplanes. There's probably things in airplanes that remain in there despite all the inspections, given the years and years of flight that they've endured.
Did you at least check the best before date on it? And finally, if I can end with, it seems to me like you've actually been one of the youngest people to have done the roles that you've done whilst you've been doing them. So can you tell us a bit about that experience, and then also share with us a message for young girls and women who want to follow in your footsteps, or indeed anyone who wants to follow in your footsteps and become a pilot?
I think maybe youth is still perceived in a certain way, and it's been very difficult in some roles to be taken with the gravitas and the respect, I suppose, that the position kind of beholds. And it's a constant cycle of proving oneself, but over time, so that people learn to trust. So yeah, being young has been much harder than being female. As I've said, I haven't had any particularly negative experiences from being a girl in the aviation industry. Believe in yourself is the message. Work really hard is part 2. Don't listen to anybody that tells you you can't do something. If you feel that you can or that you want to, then it's for you. Orientate your choices appropriately. Do the correct subjects in school. So the maths, the physics, that is important. Always have a backup plan. Always calculate, always have a way out, and never let them see you bleed, in the words of James Bond. But yeah, it's a bit like that. It's just a question of making very, very careful, calculated choices. But you can do it. You can do it. I'm the proof of the pudding. I've come from a very unusual background. If I can do it, so can you. So keep at it.
Great. Well, I think that's a fantastic message to end on. So thank you very much, Isabelle. That concludes our interview. Thank you for joining Aerotime today. It's been fantastic speaking to you. You've got an amazing story and certainly one that I'm sure lots of people will find inspiring. I've no doubt you'll continue to be a role model for so many young aviators in the industry. And thank you for all that you do and for sharing your time with us. That brings us to the end of, thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of this Aerotime interview, but do continue to follow us for more articles and interviews marking this week to recognise and celebrate the contribution and success of pilots to today's world. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Victoria O'Brien, and you've been watching Aerotime. Goodbye.